6 August 1945. Tinian Island, in the Mariana chain, 3,000 kilometers south of Tokyo. It is just past 2 in the morning, and beneath a canopy of tropical stars, a modified B-29 Superfortress sits on the runway at North Field, her polished aluminium skin catching the glare of floodlights. Ground crews move around her with the quiet urgency of men who know they are watching something unrepeatable. Painted beneath the cockpit window in neat black letters is a name borrowed from the pilot's mother, Enola Gay. Inside the aircraft's bomb bay hangs a single weapon, 3 meters long, painted matte black, nicknamed with grim understatement, Little Boy. It weighs roughly 4 tons, and it represents the largest and most secretive industrial undertaking in human history to that point. 12 men will fly this aircraft today. Most of them do not yet fully understand what they are carrying. At 2:45 a.m. local time, Colonel Paul Tibbets eases the throttles forward. The B-29, stripped of guns and armor to save weight, is dangerously overloaded with fuel and its terrible cargo. The runway is barely long enough. Witnesses on the ground later recall holding their breath as the bomber uses almost every meter of tarmac before finally clawing into the night sky. 6 hours of flight lie ahead, across open ocean, towards a city that has, by design, been left almost untouched by previous bombing raids, preserved so that the effects of what is coming can be properly measured. By the time the sun rises over Japan, Enola Gay will have changed the character of warfare forever. This is the story of how a single aeroplane, a single crew, and a single bomb brought the most destructive weapon ever built into contact with a city for the first time, and why the mission that carried it there was, in its own strange way, as remarkable an achievement as the bomb itself. By 1945, the Pacific War had ground into a brutal war of attrition that showed no sign of ending on reasonable terms. American planners looked at the cost of invading the Japanese home islands and did not like what they saw. The fighting on Iwo Jima had cost close to 7,000 American dead to take an island of barely 20 square kilometers. Okinawa, taken that same spring, had cost over 12,000 American lives, and by conservative estimates, well over 100,000 Japanese and Okinawan civilian and military deaths combined. Planners extrapolating those casualty rates onto an invasion of the Japanese mainland produced projections that ran into the hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties, and Japanese losses that could have run into the millions. Conventional bombing had not broken Japan's will to fight, despite its horrifying cost. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of 9th to 10th March 1945 had killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bombing would kill outright, and it had not produced surrender. 67 Japanese cities had, by the summer of 1945, been substantially burned out by incendiary raids, and still the Japanese government, dominated by a military faction determined to fight on, showed no willingness to accept unconditional surrender. The naval blockade was strangling Japan's ability to feed itself and supply its industry, but blockades take time, and time meant more men dying in a war that had already run for years. American planners faced an uncomfortable calculation: continue a campaign of blockade and conventional bombing that might take many more months and cost many more lives, or attempt an invasion that carried casualty projections no democratic government could easily accept, or find some third option that might end the war outright. That third option had, since 1942, been quietly taking shape in laboratories and factories scattered across the United States, under a code name chosen for the New York district where its administrative offices first opened, the Manhattan Project. It represented an almost incomprehensible commitment of national resources, employing at its peak more than 130,000 people and consuming close to $2 billion, an amount roughly equivalent to $28 billion in today's money. The challenge its scientists faced was not merely theoretical. They had to take an idea rooted in nuclear physics only a few years old and turn it into a deliverable weapon reliable enough to be dropped from an aircraft and detonated with confidence over an enemy city. No one had ever built anything like it. No one even knew for certain that it would work. The physics behind the weapon had been understood in outline since the discovery of nuclear fission in Germany in 1938. Splitting the nucleus of certain heavy atoms released a colossal amount of energy, and if enough of the right material could be brought together, quickly enough, a self-sustaining chain reaction would follow, releasing that energy almost instantaneously. Understanding the principle, however, was a very different matter from engineering it into a working device, and the design work fell to the scientists gathered under Robert Oppenheimer at a secret laboratory built specifically for the purpose at Los Alamos, New Mexico, a remote mesa chosen precisely because there was nothing there to see. Little Boy used uranium-235, an isotope that occurs naturally in only tiny proportions and had to be painstakingly separated from the far more common uranium-238 at a vast industrial complex built at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The scale of that facility is difficult to grasp even today. It drew more electricity than entire American cities and employed tens of thousands of workers, the overwhelming majority of whom had no idea what they were building or why. The design that emerged relied on a comparatively simple mechanism, one considered so likely to succeed that it was never even tested before use, unlike its plutonium counterpart. Two masses of uranium, each smaller than what physicists call a critical mass on its own, were brought together at the moment of detonation to form a single mass capable of sustaining a runaway chain reaction. The weapon itself weighed around 4,400 kilograms and measured just over 3 meters in length, roughly the size of a small delivery van, an oddly mundane comparison for something so consequential. Assembling the aircraft to carry it required its own quiet feat of engineering. A special unit, the 509th Composite Group, was formed under Colonel Paul Tibbets specifically to deliver the weapon, and a small number of B-29 Superfortresses were structurally modified at a facility in Nebraska to accept the unusually shaped bomb, with reinforced bomb bay doors, new release mechanisms, and every unnecessary kilogram of armor and weaponry stripped away to maximize range and altitude. The crews trained for months over the American desert, dropping dummy weapons nicknamed pumpkin bombs for their shape and color, without ever being told precisely what the real weapon would be. Production of the fissile material itself remains, even 8 decades on, only partially documented in public records, and historians still rely on estimates for exactly how much uranium-235 the Oak Ridge facility had managed to produce by the summer of 1945, since a great deal of that information remained classified for decades afterwards. The mission itself unfolded with a strange, almost bureaucratic calm. Enola Gay was accompanied by 2 observation aircraft, the Great Artiste and a then-unnamed photographic plane, each carrying scientific instruments to measure the blast and record it on film. Weather reconnaissance aircraft had gone ahead to confirm clear skies over the primary target, Hiroshima, a city of roughly 350,000 people that served as a major military and industrial hub and had notably been spared from the firebombing campaign specifically so that the effects of this new weapon could be observed against an undamaged urban landscape. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. At 8:15 a.m. local time, Bombardier Thomas Farabee released Little Boy from 31,000 feet. The bomb fell for just under 43 seconds before detonating around 600 meters above the city, close to the Ioy Bridge, chosen as an easily identifiable aiming point. Tibbets immediately banked the aircraft into a steep diving turn, a maneuver practiced for months, to put maximum distance between the bomber and the blast before the shockwave arrived. Tail gunner Robert Caron, watching from the rear of the aircraft, later described a column of smoke and fire boiling upward like a mushroom, giving the world an image that would define the atomic age. Crew members reported the shockwave striking the aircraft with a force that felt, to several of them, like flak bursting close beneath the fuselage, even from a distance of nearly 19 kilometers. On the ground, the effects were beyond anything conventional weapons had produced. Temperatures near the hypocenter reached several thousand degrees Celsius in an instant. Estimates of the immediate death toll vary considerably, reflecting the chaos of the event and the destruction of records, but historians generally place deaths by the end of 1945, accounting for injuries and radiation sickness, somewhere between 90,000 and 140,000 people, out of a city of roughly 350,000. German efforts toward a nuclear weapon, by contrast, never came close to producing a usable device. The German program, hampered by the emigration of many leading physicists fleeing Nazi persecution, by strategic misjudgments about the timeline needed, and by Allied sabotage of Norwegian heavy water production, never progressed beyond experimental reactor work. Werner Heisenberg's team was still struggling to achieve a sustained chain reaction in a laboratory setting as late as 1945, years behind where the Manhattan Project stood. When German physicists interned in England after the war heard the news of Hiroshima on the radio, several reportedly refused to believe it at first, a moment captured in secretly recorded transcripts of their conversations. The comparison illustrates just how enormous a lead America's industrial and scientific mobilization had achieved. Germany simply never fielded a comparable program, not through lack of theoretical understanding, but through a catastrophic underestimation of the resources such a project would require. The impact of the bombing, both material and psychological, remains debated by historians to this day, and honest accounts must acknowledge that debate rather than paper over it. What is not disputed is that a second weapon, of a different design using plutonium, was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later, and that Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, ending the Second World War. How much weight the atomic bombings carried in that decision relative to the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan and invasion of Manchuria on August 8th remains a genuine subject of historical argument, and serious historians differ, some emphasizing the bomb, others the Soviet entry, most acknowledging both played a role that is difficult now to disentangle. What is beyond dispute is the weapon's legacy. The bombing of Hiroshima marked the opening of the nuclear age, ushering in a Cold War defined by weapons stockpiles vastly more destructive than anything used in 1945, and a doctrine of deterrence that has shaped international relations for 8 decades. Enola Gay herself survives today, meticulously restored, on permanent display at the Smithsonian's Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center near Washington Dulles Airport, where visitors can stand beneath her polished fuselage and reflect on the weight of what she carried. In Hiroshima itself, the skeletal dome of the former Industrial Promotion Hall, left deliberately unrepaired near the hypocenter, stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a permanent memorial to the tens of thousands who died beneath that August sky. There is something almost unbearably ordinary about the mechanics of the mission itself. A well-drilled crew, following a well-rehearsed procedure, flying a modified version of an aircraft already in widespread service, dropping a single object from a great height on a clear summer morning. No armada, no prolonged battle. Just 12 men, 1 airplane, and 6 hours of flight across an empty ocean. And yet, in the space of those 43 seconds between release and detonation, the entire calculus of warfare shifted permanently, and humanity crossed a threshold it has never been able to cross back over. Paul Tibbets named his aircraft after his mother, a woman who, by his own account, had supported his decision to become a pilot when his father wanted him to study medicine. It is a strangely tender detail to attach to a mission that would end so many lives, and perhaps that tension is the point. The people who built, flew, and dropped this weapon were not monsters out of some simpler moral story. They were engineers solving an engineering problem, airmen executing an assigned mission, and political leaders making calculations about ending a war that had already killed tens of millions of people worldwide. Whether those calculations were the right ones is a question each generation continues to argue over, and this film will not pretend to settle it for you. What can be said with confidence is this. Before August 6, 1945, no single weapon delivered by a single aircraft had ever leveled a city in an instant. After that morning, every government on Earth had to reckon with the fact that such a weapon existed, that it worked, and that it could be built again. Bigger, by anyone with the industrial capacity to try. The Cold War arms race, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the ongoing diplomatic struggle over nuclear proliferation that continues in the headlines today, all of it traces back to those 43 seconds over Hiroshima. Enola Gay was, in the end, just an airplane, a modified bomber built in Nebraska, flown by men who had trained for months without fully knowing what they carried. But she became something else the moment her bomb bay doors opened over the Ayoy Bridge, the vehicle through which the atomic age arrived on Earth, carried not by some faceless machine, but by 12 named men doing a job they had been ordered to do on a clear morning, in a war that had already gone on for far too long. She sits in her museum today, silent and gleaming. A single aircraft that ended one war and began another kind,